The sharp clack of Margaret's high heels echoed throughout the house, growing louder with each step. Robert, hunched over his laptop at the dining table, was lost in his work, unaware of his surroundings, focused solely on the flickering screen. The steady ticking of the clock was the only sound until the sudden noise of heels shattered the stillness. His gaze lifted, unfocused at first, then sharpened as it landed on Margaret standing at the doorway. She was wearing a tight, striking white dress, undeniably captivating. That dress, he hadn't seen it in years. It hugged her figure in a way that made her impossible to ignore. Her lips, painted a bold red, stretched into a self-satisfied smirk as she slightly turned, admiring herself in the hallway mirror. Her hand glided down her hips, smoothing the fabric with slow, deliberate care. Robert could only stare silently, frozen in place, a growing unease creeping into his chest, like a distant warning of an approaching storm. Margaret, his voice quivered, tension lacing his words, "Where are you going?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she adjusted her hair, running her fingers through it slowly, each second of silence between them growing heavier. The tension was thick, almost ready to snap. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were cold and distant. This wasn't the woman who had been his wife for nearly 3 decades. "I'm going out tonight," she said, her voice unsettlingly calm. "I'm meeting my lover." The words came out so casually, as if she were discussing something mundane. Robert pushed his laptop aside and stood, as though the weight of her words had physically struck him. "What are you saying?" he stammered, struggling to grasp the meaning of her revelation. "You're not going anywhere," he added, desperation creeping into his tone. There were no plans for the evening. Their lives had been quiet lately, filled with simple dinners and nights on the couch. "With who?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a heavy knot forming in his stomach. Her smile widened, full of satisfaction. "With Michael," she replied. The ease with which she said the name sent a painful knot into Robert's throat. "Michael," his voice cracked. "My boss, Michael." The words felt like poison, and his pulse quickened, as if the room was closing in around him. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he searched her face, hoping for even the smallest sign that this was some cruel joke, but her expression remained unchanged, distant, triumphant. "Yes, your boss," she confirmed, waving her hand dismissively, as if the gravity of the situation didn't matter. "We've been seeing each other for about a year, Robert." It felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath him. The usual calm that defined him vanished, replaced with a trembling fury. His fists clenched at his sides as he shook with disbelief and rising anger. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice unsteady but firm as he stood his ground, his eyes locked on hers. "This can't be true, Margaret. It just can't." She crossed her arms over her chest, her stance defiant, daring him to question her. There was a cruel glint in her eyes. "I'm not bluffing, Robert. Michael makes me feel something you haven't in years. I promised him an unforgettable night." Robert flinched as if her words had physically struck him. "This is madness," he growled, spitting out Michael's name as if it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "You're leaving me for him? Michael's a womanizer. He doesn't care about you." Her expression turned icy. "And you do," she shot back. "When was the last time you looked at me like that? You've become a shadow of the man I married, predictable, dull. Michael makes me feel wanted." Robert stood frozen, thunderstruck, unable to comprehend that the woman he had shared nearly 30 years with was standing before him, admitting to an affair with his boss, his hands balled into fists, nails digging painfully into his palms. "You can't do this, Margaret." She rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. "Don't tell me what I can or can't do. I'm not following your rules anymore. This marriage ended long ago, and I'm done pretending." Robert's anger surged like a wave crashing down. "Are you really ready to throw away 28 years, Margaret? 28 years of memories? Everything we've built, are you willing to risk it all for this fling?" Her face hardened with frustration. "It's more than a fling. Michael makes me feel alive, something you haven't done in years. You've become an empty shell of the man you once were," she said coldly, "and I won't pretend I'm happy anymore." Robert stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tightly it aches. "I don't care what you think of me," he growled, his voice low and filled with restrained fury, "but tonight you're not going anywhere, not with him, not with anyone." Margaret raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "Don't you dare try to control me, Robert," she hissed. "You never had any power over me, and you never will. I made Michael a promise, and I intend to keep it." Robert's heart raced as he stared at her, struggling to process her audacity. "If you walk out that door," he warned, his voice trembling with finality, "we're done. Do you hear me, Margaret? This will be the end." Margaret paused for a moment, narrowing her eyes as if weighing his words carefully. Then, with a dismissive wave, she brushed him off like he was nothing more than a speck of dust. "You're pathetic," she spat, her voice icy, each word deliberately cruel. Robert felt his breath catch in his throat. He stood motionless, trapped in place, while Margaret, calm and indifferent, picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Each of Margaret's steps reverberated through the room like the ticking of a clock counting down the final moments of their marriage. "Margaret," Robert called after her, his voice thick with desperation. "If you walk out now, don't think about coming back." She kept walking, never stopping. The door creaked open, letting the cold night air sweep into their home like an unwelcome guest. Then there was a soft but resolute click as the door shut behind her, severing her from his life for good. Robert stood, staring at the closed door as if his gaze alone could make it open again, hoping she might turn around and come back. But the house was now empty, consumed by a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. His heart raced, a mixture of confusion and anger constricting his breath. Slowly he sank into a chair, his trembling fingers brushing over his face, the weight of what had just occurred pressing down on him, a burden he wasn't ready to bear. She wasn't just gone for the night, she was gone from his life, their marriage, and everything they had built together. The crushing reality of her betrayal gripped him, squeezing his heart like a vice. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where she had stood just moments ago, now only emptiness in her place. Memories of their years together flickered through his mind like pieces of a broken film, dinners, vacations, quiet moments, all of it shattered in an instant. For the first time in 28 years, he was truly alone, in a house that suddenly felt too big, too empty. He sat, enveloped by an endless silence, his thoughts circling back to their final conversation, the mocking laughter, the cutting words, the way she left as if none of it mattered. Gradually, something inside him began to shift. Shock slowly transformed into something darker, more resolute. His jaw tightened and his eyes hardened. She thought she could leave him broken, that his world would collapse without her, but she had no idea what awaited her. Robert's gaze drifted around the room, settling on the framed photographs on the walls, moments of happiness, once frozen in time, now haunting reminders of a life that no longer existed. She was willing to throw it all away for a fleeting affair with his boss. Fine. But this wasn't the end. Abruptly, Robert stood from his chair, a sudden clarity hitting him. The way forward was no longer unclear, there was only one option, and he would carry it out on his terms. That night, sleep felt like a distant thought. He lay still in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying the evening's events over and over, the sound of Margaret's heels clicking on the floor, her harsh words, and that cold, mocking laugh swirled in his mind like a relentless storm. The woman he had spent nearly 30 years with had chosen to leave him for his boss, no less. The betrayal hit like lightning, as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. His world was in ruins. But amid the wreckage, another emotion began to rise: revenge. As the hours passed, his grief morphed into something colder, more focused. He wasn't going to plead for her to return. There would be no apologies, no desperate attempts to salvage a marriage that was beyond repair. Margaret had made her choice, and now she would have to face the consequences. As the first rays of morning light streamed through the window, Robert made his decision. Slowly he rose from bed, walked to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. He stared into the mirror at his reflection. The man looking back at him was no longer the one who had been blindsided hours earlier. This man was resolute, determined, and ready to reclaim control. Without hesitation, Robert got dressed and made his way to the kitchen. The silence in the house weighed heavily on him, but he pushed it aside. There was work to do. Sitting at the dining table, he picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer. After 2 rings, a familiar but groggy voice answered. "Robert, it's early." "What's going on? I need you to start the divorce proceedings," Robert replied, his voice steady and firm. There was a brief pause. "Are you sure about this?" "Divorce is a serious step, I'm sure," he said, his tone unwavering. "No delays. I want it done quickly and cleanly." "All right," the lawyer said, now fully alert. Robert ended the call and exhaled slowly. He would handle the paperwork. It only required a few signatures, but he was determined to push it through as fast as possible. After setting the phone down, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the calm emptiness of the kitchen. It was done. There was no turning back, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Margaret wouldn't win him over again with her charm, sweet words, or hollow promises. He would ensure she never got another chance. His next focus was their joint bank account, which they had managed together for years, but he wasn't about to let her use their savings to run off with Michael. With a decisive move, he transferred all the money into his personal account, leaving the joint account completely drained. Margaret had made it clear she didn't need him, and now she wouldn't see a cent of his money. Once that was handled, his attention shifted to the house. The place that had once symbolized their shared dreams now felt like a prison filled with painful memories. Without delay, Robert contacted a real estate agent and put the house on the market. Any emotional attachment to it had long since disappeared. "Are you sure you want to sell it this quickly?" the agent asked, sensing his urgency. "Absolutely," Robert replied, his voice cold and firm. "Set a low price. I just want it gone by noon." Everything was already in motion. The divorce papers were being prepared, the bank account was cleared, and the house was officially listed for sale. The speed of it all left Robert feeling slightly off balance, as if events were moving faster than he could fully grasp. But there was no room for hesitation. Margaret had made her decision, and now Robert was determined to ensure she faced the consequences alone. He sat back at the kitchen table, glancing around one last time. This place was no longer a home, just an empty shell echoing with what used to be. His eyes settled on the photos still hanging on the walls, snapshots of happy times, vacations, holidays, birthdays now stained by her betrayal. Rising from his seat, he walked over to the nearest picture, staring at the faces frozen in time. It was him and Margaret during their anniversary trip to Paris. He had believed they were happy then. Maybe they were, or perhaps it had always been an illusion. With a heavy sigh of resignation, he took the picture down, laying it face down on the table. One by one, he removed each photo, leaving the walls bare, stripped of the past. He could no longer bear to look at them. When the last frame was gone, Robert returned to the kitchen, grabbed a piece of paper, and scribbled a brief note. "You made your choice." He placed it next to the neatly arranged divorce papers his lawyer had sent earlier. The reality of the situation was now crystal clear, leaving no room for denial. The act was over. The lies, the pretending, it had all come to an end. With one final glance around the room, Robert grabbed his car keys. He didn't want to see her reaction or hear whatever words she might choose. However she dealt with it, he no longer cared. This chapter of his life was closed, and he had no intention of looking back. As he drove away, a strange sense of calm began to wash over him. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it felt different now, more focused, more controlled. For the first time in years, Robert felt like he was steering his own destiny. He wasn't the broken man Margaret had left behind the night before. He was someone new, stronger. The city blurred into streaks of color as he drove, without any particular destination in mind. But that didn't matter. Only one thing was clear: he couldn't return to that house. Not yet. He needed distance, room to breathe, to think, to decide his next steps. After what seemed like hours, Robert pulled into a parking lot by the coast. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow across the sky. He stepped out of the car, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face, and walked toward the ocean. The steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore was a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed him in the last 24 hours. As he stood there, staring at the horizon, he felt the weight of everything that had happened begin to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while he didn't feel trapped. The chains of a suffocating marriage, bound by others' expectations, had finally been broken. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Robert turned away from the water and walked back to his car. His mind was made up, and now it was Margaret's turn to face the consequences. He had no desire to witness her fall apart. His focus was on rebuilding his life, and that had become his only concern. When Margaret returned the next day, the click of her heels on the parquet floor echoed through the empty house. She was bracing for a confrontation, perhaps expecting a heated argument where she could assert her newfound freedom with Michael, the life she had chosen. In her mind, Robert was waiting, probably seething with rage, but ready to beg for her forgiveness. She believed she held all the power, finally free from the man she had come to despise. But as she stepped further into the house, something felt off. The silence that greeted her wasn't just empty, it was unsettling, almost unnatural, sending a chill down her spine. Robert, she called, her voice slicing through the heavy silence like a knife. There was no answer, only the dull echo of her own voice. Slowly she made her way toward the kitchen, her heels tapping rhythmically on the floor, expecting to find him there, perhaps brooding or even in tears. But what she found was far more shocking. On the kitchen table, neatly arranged with unsettling precision, were the divorce papers. The sight of them hit her like a punch to the stomach, instantly erasing any joy she had felt after her night with Michael. The laughter that had bubbled in her chest earlier vanished, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Margaret stood frozen, staring at the meticulously ordered papers and the brief, cold note beside them. "You made your choice. Now live with it." Her breath caught in her throat, and her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't what she had imagined. She had expected Robert to be devastated by her betrayal, to storm in with accusations or break down in grief, but to disappear. That possibility had never even crossed her mind. Her hands trembled as she picked up the papers, flipping through them in disbelief. It was real. He had initiated the divorce. Everything was laid out perfectly, only her signature was missing. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. A wave of panic surged through her as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Robert's number. Each unanswered ring felt like a hammer pounding in her head. "Robert, please, pick up," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. The call went to voicemail. Panic turned to desperation as she left a frantic message, her voice quivering, pleading. "Robert, it's Margaret. We need to talk. Please call me." She sent message after message, each one more frantic than the last, but none of them were read. Not a single response. It was as if he had vanished from existence. The crushing reality began to sink in. Robert wasn't waiting for her. He wasn't coming back. He was gone. Her panic rising, Margaret rushed upstairs to their bedroom and flung open the closet doors. His clothes were gone. His shoes, his belongings, everything was missing. She hurried to the bathroom, yanking open the medicine cabinet. Empty. It was as if he had meticulously erased every trace of himself from the house. The full, devastating realization of what had happened crashed over her like a tidal wave. Robert wasn't merely hurt, he was resolute. Standing before the empty closet, Margaret's heart raced uncontrollably. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. She had always assumed Robert would be the one who couldn't cope without her, the one to crumble under the weight of their separation. But now she stood amidst the wreckage, feeling stripped of everything she once relied on. Stumbling, she made her way downstairs, her thoughts in a whirlwind, and rushed to the computer, her heart hammering with panic. She logged into their bank account, hoping to find some comfort, but what she saw only deepened her terror. The balance was a cold, unforgiving zero. Robert had taken all the money, the savings they had carefully built over the years gone. He had transferred everything into an account she couldn't access. "No," she whispered, her throat tightening. He wouldn't do this, but he had. Every cent had vanished, their money, their home, their shared life, everything dissolved before her eyes. The crushing reality bore down on her, her head spinning, as the consequences of her choices weighed heavily. She had lost it all, but for what? A brief, empty fling with her husband's boss. The phone rang, snapping her out of her stupor. It was Michael. For a fleeting moment, she hoped he would save her from this nightmare. "Michael will fix this," she told herself. She picked up the phone, struggling to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Michael," she whispered, "I need to talk. Robert is gone. He took everything." The line fell silent. When Michael finally spoke, his tone was distant. "Yeah," he muttered, sending a chill down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. Michael sighed heavily. "Margaret, what we had was fun, exciting even, but I'm not looking for anything serious." Her body froze. "What are you saying?" "We've been together for almost a year," she stammered, disbelief washing over her. "Yeah, it was great," he replied, his casual tone cutting through her like a knife, "but I'm not here to commit. You left Robert, that's your problem, not mine." Margaret clutched the phone, paralyzed by shock. "You're just going to walk away?" After everything, her voice trembled, but Michael's response was cold. "Margaret, this was your choice. You turned your back on your marriage, not me." His words hit her like a slap. It was the same thing Robert had written in his letter. "Michael, wait," she began, her voice shaking, but he cut her off. "Look, I've got too much going on. I don't have time for this drama," he said, his tone distant and final. "It's best if we stop seeing each other," and with that, The line went dead. Margaret stood there, holding the phone to her ear long after the call ended. The man she had sacrificed everything for had discarded her as easily as cancelling a dinner reservation. In frustration, she hurled the phone onto the counter, her hands trembling. This couldn't be real. Her world was falling apart. First she lost Robert, now Michael was gone too. And with him, the life she thought she owned disappeared. The days that followed blurred into one another. Margaret tried to piece her life back together, but it was already in shambles. She packed her belongings and moved into a rundown motel, struggling to figure out what to do next. The luxurious life she had envisioned with Michael had turned into a nightmare. Every attempt to contact Robert was met with silence. He ignored her calls and messages, as if he had vanished, leaving her to face the ruins alone. She considered returning to work, but the thought of seeing Michael again made her stomach churn. What had once been an exciting affair had become a source of shame. She could already hear her colleagues whispering behind her back, certain they knew everything. With her marriage destroyed, she doubted she'd keep her job much longer. Michael could fire her with little effort, and as the weeks dragged on, Margaret's hope faded. Glamorous dinners and nights in luxury hotels were replaced by lonely evenings in the dingy motel, where the stench of cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning products clung to her clothes. Michael's promises of a future together vanished, leaving her with nothing but regret. Margaret had to confront the consequences of her actions, consequences that had cost her everything. While her life was unraveling, Robert's was finally coming together. The chaos of his old life behind him, Robert found himself at a crossroads. Though the weeks after his departure were filled with uncertainty, they also brought a newfound freedom he hadn't experienced in years. The burden of a marriage where he had constantly tried to please a woman who no longer cared was lifted. He realized it was time to take control of his future. The first step was cutting all ties with the past that had held him back. He found a modest apartment in a different part of the city, far from the home that held too many painful memories. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. There was no trace of Margaret, nothing to remind him of their shared life. This was his clean slate, a place where he could rebuild himself without the constant weight of a failed marriage. The first few days felt strange, the silence almost unsettling, but it wasn't the kind that suffocated, it was comforting. It was the quiet of a life no longer dictated by someone else's needs. He busied himself with small tasks, organizing, cleaning, adjusting to his new surroundings. For the first time in years, Robert didn't have to explain his decisions to anyone. But as the novelty of his new home wore off, Robert shifted his focus back to his career. Michael had always belittled him, keeping him under his thumb and undermining his confidence. But now, with both Michael and Margaret behind him, Robert saw an opportunity to reevaluate his life. He wasn't just aiming to move past his personal struggles, he was determined to excel in every part of his life. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Robert opened his laptop and started applying for new jobs. He wasn't just looking for a paycheck, he wanted a role that would challenge him and help him grow. He sent out several well-crafted applications, highlighting his skills, experience, and determination. Within a week, responses started coming in, with companies eager to bring him on board. One offer stood out, a startup in the tech industry known for its innovation and forward-thinking culture. Something about the opportunity sparked something in Robert. He scheduled an interview, and within a few days he found himself sitting across from the CEO, sharing his ideas, goals, and how he could contribute to the company's success. The conversation went unexpectedly well, and he was offered a position right on the spot, along with a promotion he had never imagined. It came with more responsibility, a considerable salary bump, and a level of independence he'd never experienced before. As Robert walked out of the office, a wave of exhilaration swept over him. He had finally escaped the suffocating grip of Michael and the job that had stifled him for so long. This was the beginning of his new chapter, bringing with it financial security. No more worries about making ends meet, no more concerns about shared accounts or financial burdens. Robert recently treated himself to a new car, sleek, efficient, and a representation of how far he'd come. For the first time, there was no pang of guilt accompanying the purchase. This was a reward he had truly earned. As the months passed, Robert threw himself into his work, and his career began to advance at a pace that took even him by surprise. He earned not only the respect of his colleagues, but also the recognition and admiration of the higher-ups. However, this promotion was about more than just a new title or a larger paycheck. It was about proving to himself that he could achieve success entirely on his own. He was no longer the man Margaret had turned away from, nor the one Michael had ridiculed. He had become someone greater, and his growth extended beyond his professional life. Robert began prioritizing his physical and emotional well-being for the first time in years. He joined a gym, and his days took on a structure and purpose they hadn't had before. Mornings started with early runs at dawn, the sound of his feet hitting the pavement echoing his commitment to himself. In the evenings he focused on strength training, and with each session he felt more powerful and confident. It wasn't about getting back at Margaret anymore, it was about reconnecting with himself. Gradually, small but meaningful victories accumulated. He woke up in his new home feeling truly rested for the first time in years. Weekends were spent hiking nearby trails, and the fresh mountain air cleared his mind, pushing away lingering doubts. He formed genuine connections with his new colleagues, people who valued him for his skills and character, not for his past. Step by step, Robert was building a life that was entirely his. One evening, sitting on his balcony with a glass of wine, he gazed out at the city skyline, and a realization struck him: he was genuinely happy. It wasn't the superficial happiness that came from material success or career advancements, though those were important too. It was a deeper contentment that comes from surviving a dark period in life and emerging stronger on the other side. Occasionally, Margaret crossed his mind, but those memories no longer caused him pain or haunted him like they once had. Now she was just a distant memory, a part of his past that no longer held any sway over him. He had learned, grown, and, most importantly, moved on. Margaret might have tried to break him, but in the end, all she did was free him from a life that had been holding him back. As he sat there with a smile on his face, Robert reflected on how far he'd come. He now had everything he once feared to go after. Where Margaret was, he didn't know, but for the first time he realized he didn't care. Her decisions had led her down a path that no longer had any bearing on his life. Their roads had diverged, and for Robert, that was the greatest gift of all. He had come to a profound realization: his happiness was his own responsibility, and that understanding weighed on him as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in golden tones. Quietly, he raised his glass in a personal toast to himself. His life, once shattered by the end of his marriage, had been rebuilt with a strength he never knew he had. What he possessed now felt new, more meaningful, and he sensed it was only the start of something even greater. While Robert's world was finally flourishing, Margaret's was collapsing under the weight of her choices. Time passed, but Margaret's guilt grew with each day. The thrill of her affair with Michael had long since faded, leaving behind the painful realization of what she had given up for a fleeting moment of excitement. She had sacrificed her marriage, her stability, and the life she once cherished. Now all that remained was to live with the bitter consequences of her decisions, isolated in her regret. At first, Margaret convinced herself that things would improve after Michael left. She clung to the hope of a fresh start, and even went on dates, trying to recapture that feeling of excitement. But nothing compared. The men she met lacked the reliability and kindness that Robert had provided so effortlessly. They were either selfish or unreliable, and despite her efforts to move forward, the emptiness inside her refused to fade. Many nights, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, wondering how her life had unraveled so completely. Her thoughts often drifted back to her time with Robert, their home, their shared memories, the quiet moments of comfort she had once taken for granted. All of it was gone, and there was no one to blame but herself. One chilly evening, as she scrolled through old photos on her phone, Margaret stumbled across a picture from their 20th anniversary. They stood on a beach, the sunset glowing behind them, both smiling as if nothing else in the world mattered. Her finger hovered over the image, and her chest tightened. She vividly recalled that day, the surprise trip Robert had planned, the joy she had felt, and the depth of his love for her. Tears welled up in her eyes, and before she knew it, they were streaming down her face. "What have I done?" she whispered, burying her face in her hands as the full weight of her regret engulfed her, leaving her to grapple with the choices that had led her here. Margaret had convinced herself that the blame rested on Robert, that he simply wasn't enough for her, but in reality it was she who had fallen short. She had let herself be drawn in by Michael's hollow promises and the excitement of something different, and in doing so she destroyed the one thing that truly mattered to her. As each day passed, thoughts of Robert filled her mind more and more. But she couldn't stop wondering where he was, how his life had progressed, and whether he had finally found the happiness she had taken from him. The idea that he had moved on, living a better life than the one she now found herself trapped in, tormented her endlessly. The weight of her mistakes grew heavier by the day, and Margaret began to wonder if, by some miracle, there was still the faintest hope for redemption. Could she ask for his forgiveness? The notion seemed laughable at first, after all. She had been the one who left, mocking his desperate pleas for her to stay that fateful night. Still, the guilt was so overwhelming that she couldn't shake the urge to try something, anything. One day she sat down at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper, the pen frozen in her trembling hand as she struggled to find the right words. How could she convey the depth of her regret? How could she possibly ask for forgiveness when she knew deep down she didn't deserve it? Time passed agonizingly slowly as she fought with herself, but finally she forced herself to begin writing. Robert, I don't even know how to start this or if you'll ever read it, but I have to at least try. I've spent years reflecting on everything that happened, and not a day has passed that I haven't regretted my actions. I know I can't undo the pain I caused, and I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Margaret paused, the familiar weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest before she continued writing. But I need you to know how deeply sorry I am. Leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. I was selfish and blind to everything you did for me, and only later did I realize what I had truly lost. I thought I needed something more, something different. But now I understand just how wrong I was. You were more than enough, and I was too foolish to see it. She sighed heavily, feeling the crushing burden of the past as she wrote on. I'm not asking for a second chance, I know that's long gone. I just want you to know how much I regret everything. You deserved far more than I ever gave you, and I'm sorry I wasn't the partner you needed. I hope you found happiness, Robert. Her hand shook as she signed the letter with deep sorrow. Tears blurred the final words as she reread the letter over and over again. With care, she folded it and slipped it into an envelope. She wasn't sure if Robert would ever open it, but sending it was the only step she could take to try and make things right, however small and insignificant it seemed. In the following days, Margaret was overwhelmed with anxiety. She checked the mailbox constantly, hoping for some kind of response. Deep down, she knew the chances were slim, but a tiny part of her held on to the hope that Robert might reply. Maybe he would understand the sincerity of her regret, maybe he would even let her apologize in person. But as days turned into weeks, the painful truth grew clearer. There would be no reply. For weeks, her mailbox remained empty, each day passing without any word from Robert. The silence became louder in her heart with each passing moment. His absence wasn't just physical, he had moved on to a new life in which she no longer had a place. She had destroyed their bond, and now he lived in a future where she didn't exist. One rainy afternoon, while sitting by the window, listening to the soft rhythm of raindrops, she heard a faint phone ring from the table. It was a message from an old acquaintance she hadn't spoken to in ages. The subject line made her flinch. Robert, her heart raced as she opened the message with trembling fingers. It was brief, only a few lines, but its contents struck her like a tidal wave. Robert had remarried. He had found someone who valued him in ways Margaret never had. The message mentioned that they had recently purchased a house and were expecting their first child together. The weight of the news crushed her, leaving her gasping for breath. Her vision blurred as she struggled to process what she had just read. Robert hadn't just moved on, he had thrived. He had built something beautiful, something Margaret could never give him, far removed from the ruins she had left behind. For the first time, the full consequences of her decisions stood before her in stark clarity. There would be no return, no chance of reconciliation. Robert had permanently pushed her into the past, forging a future in which she no longer belonged. As the rain continued to fall softly against the window, Margaret sat frozen, the silence around her deepening. This was the life she had carved out for herself, a life filled with regret, and the only person she could blame was herself. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it, alone. Margaret had never imagined her life would fall apart this way, isolated, empty, burdened by the weight of her mistakes. Once she had dreamed of a thrilling future with Michael, the man for whom she had risked everything, but that dream had never materialized. Over time, the illusion of a better life with him crumbled, leaving her face to face with the harsh reality of loneliness. One gloomy evening, she sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at her reflection in the window. In the distance, the city lights sparkled, but inside, her world was consumed by darkness. The silence pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. It had been 2 years since she last heard anything about Michael. He had abandoned her with the same indifference with which their affair had ended. No explanations, no apologies, just gone, leaving her to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. At that moment, her phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen, hoping for some sign of connection, perhaps a job offer or a message from a friend, but it was nothing more than another reminder of her mounting debts. A bill notification broke through the quiet of her empty world. Margaret's financial situation had completely collapsed. A series of impulsive choices, extravagant divorce costs, and the sudden loss of her support system had left her utterly alone. The friends who had once encouraged her affair, who had cast doubt on Robert's worth, disappeared as soon as her life began to crumble. Now, she was seen as a burden, someone to avoid. She sighed deeply, running her hands through her hair, remembering the days when life had seemed so simple. Robert had always been the one who took care of everything. He handled the finances, took care of the home, and made sure their lives were running smoothly. It wasn't until she lost everything that Margaret fully understood how much he had done for them. Now, she wandered through a world that seemed indifferent to her successes or failures. Her mind constantly drifted back to Robert, as it often did these days. It had become a painful habit of hers to follow his life, watching him thrive without her. A few months ago, she stumbled upon his new social media profiles, even though he had blocked her on all other platforms. His life had flourished in her absence, a stark contrast to what they once had. Every picture showed Robert smiling wider than she remembered, especially when he was with his new, stunning wife, Barbara. She had learned Barbara's name by accident during a conversation with one of Robert's old friends at the grocery store. Barbara seemed to be everything Margaret was not: loving, tender, and a woman who would never take Robert for granted. The latest post showed them on vacation in Paris, a place Margaret had always dreamed of visiting but never prioritized. That image carved itself into her memory, leaving behind a deep, aching pain. She slammed the laptop shut, desperate to block out the memories, but the weight of regret hung heavily. Even though years had passed since the divorce, the sense of guilt felt just as fresh. Every choice she had made after leaving him felt like another misstep, pulling her further into a pit with no escape. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, but it wasn't another overdue bill. It was an email from a recruiter, yet another rejection for her recent job application. Her once successful career had crumbled after rumors of her affair spread within their shared social circle. It didn't take long before those whispers reached her workplace. Soon the doors that had once opened effortlessly for her were slammed shut. She became notorious the woman who left her husband for his boss. No company wanted to be associated with the scandal that followed her. Over time, her resume became a patchwork of short-term jobs and abrupt dismissals. Now, she worked as a secretary at a real estate office, far removed from the prestigious position she once held, just to make ends meet. Her salary barely covered rent and utilities, and her savings had long since evaporated. With no safety net and no promising job prospects, her future looked bleak. In her desperation, her thoughts returned to the one option she had been avoiding for so long: reaching out to Robert. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that if she could find the right words, maybe, just maybe, he would finally see the changes in her. Maybe then he would understand. She believed there had to be a way to mend what had been broken between them. Robert had once been so kind, so patient. Surely that part of him hadn't disappeared completely. It must still be there, buried deep. Suddenly filled with determination, she opened her laptop, searching for any way to contact him. It didn't take long for her to find his new consulting firm, which he had recently founded, a clear sign of how successful his life had become since their separation. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the mouse, before finally clicking on the contact information. His professional email address stared back at her from the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she had no idea where to begin. What could she possibly say that she hadn't already said? She had already written him a heartfelt letter, pouring out her regrets, but he hadn't replied. What could make this time any different? Despite her doubts, Margaret began to type: "Robert, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, and I completely understand that, but I need to tell you how truly sorry I am for everything. I was selfish and destroyed something valuable. Since then, not a day has gone by where I haven't wished I could take it all back, though I know I can't. I'm not asking anything from you. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am. I've seen everything you've accomplished since I left, and while it hurts to know I'm no longer part of your life, I'm genuinely happy for your success. I hope that one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Margaret, she stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It felt like hours had passed as she wrestled with her emotions. What was she doing? She wasn't the desperate ex-wife clinging to a past she had ruined herself, but what else did she have left? Before she could change her mind, Margaret hit send. The email disappeared into the digital void, taking with it the last shred of hope she had been holding on to. The days blurred together after that. She constantly refreshed her inbox, waiting for any sign that Robert had seen her message. But as days turned into a week, then two, the silence became unbearable. There was no response. He had moved on, and he had every right to, my friend. And that's where the story ends. If you like this story, give it a royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.